I just wanted to know from Kathy what the result was of the marketing and the strategy guys when they were initially struggling with the concepts back in the 70s. If you look at them now, has there been progress or has it got worse?
Well, I didn't do a thorough review of the literature. These were the. You don't want to use the mic. No. This is the. I started by saying I didn't do a thorough review of the subsequent literature, but I was able to find, searching Google Scholar on these things, a number of papers on first the measurement issues, why you would want to do this, and then the significant follow-up where researchers had looked at these issues and refined the statistical techniques for the particular type of construct that they are trying to measure. So that's what I was getting at a little bit, that there isn't really one statistical method that's appropriate. And so it's a continuing and ongoing process. And even the recent papers highlight the fact that the research scientific cycle is all one cycle. You keep going, we establish a few things about research quality. You look at construct validity. That rejects some things, doesn't reject others. You keep going around and keep refining then your theory-based tests. So it's not just, as I said, one test or one set of results that we would expect to see construct validity, but establishing construct validity is part of the entire process. And so throughout the last 40 years, since 1968, we should have been doing this as part of the whole process. So I don't know was the answer to that question.
Other questions? Can I suggest? Oh, Jeff?
No, Jeff.
By all means, Jeff.
Thank you. Two questions. One of them directly to Kathy. Anybody can answer the second one. The first question is about the way you set up this sort of sequencing. And you said things like determinants were like earnings management or persistence, and then you had outcomes. And one of the things, if we're going to go down this path of checking out this literature, that sort of disturbs me is that I think of this latent construct as something that's sort of there all the time. And if I were to back up from persistence, instead of calling it a determinant, but step backwards when somebody's making a decision on what rules are for disclosure, persistence then becomes an outcome. And so at what philosophical level do we start thinking about actually measuring this thing called quality if we can't even set up the determinant to the outcome? And then the more general statement, and I guess this is for everybody actually, Ray is taking a position on the usefulness of quality that's sort of fairly neutral. If people want to use it to organize their thinking, that's fine. And you put up a quote from Schelling, which is very judgmental. And while I don't know what he said afterwards, it was almost prescriptive about getting rid of stuff that we're too lazy to deal with. So as researchers, are we supposed to think about quality as something that, as long as it's around, we'll keep researching it? Or do we start saying maybe it's time to stop messing around with this and just be very clear about what we mean in particular settings? So are we messing with the experiment as we're trying to measure the experiment with this?
In response to your first question, I agree. I needed a two-dimensional diagram up there. So I laid it out as the determinants and the consequences, recognizing that there were other missing parts of this. And at one point I had in there, but decided it was too complicated to talk about. Even having returns is used as a construct or a trait of quality in many studies, and so the whole net is collapsed in many studies, in that sense, with assumptions about efficient markets. And so I tried to simplify what this net looked like. It's actually much more complicated than that, which is, I think, what Jake was saying. But I think the general idea that holds is that the construct itself, what we define earnings quality as, is a function of how you view this whole network. And all these dimensions, however many there are, and however you define them, determinants or consequences or some other dimensions, define the construct as a whole. But it is a complicated net. I just put that example up there. And I'll take a first stab at your Schelling comment as well, because this is something I also was going to say but felt constrained on time, so eventually left out. I think it is sort of a philosophical question whether we have any reason to supply to practitioners an earnings quality score. But on the other hand, I don't think it's questionable that we as researchers have an obligation not to ensure that our research isn't misused or misinterpreted. The papers that I read that actually used the term earnings quality and say they were testing it were incredibly careful academic papers that said, this is a caveat, this is how I'm measuring it, not everybody would measure it this way, these are the problems with measuring it, you can't conclude this from my earnings quality test. And the academic papers were very careful. And yet I also saw practitioner references saying that they're going to create a quantitative earnings quality score based on academic research. And these are the 3 papers that we're using to do that. And they would pick 3 papers that had results that they liked and aggregated them in some way and then say that they have an academic-based score. And I do believe that it's our responsibility to make sure our literature isn't misused, and that we can do that by having these more rigorous tests that try to not just provide caveats that we know we're not doing construct validity, we know we don't have a valid construct, but actually go out and, on the proactive side, do the construct validity test to show whether we have a valid construct or not.
There's one theme that I somehow surprisingly find completely missing from this conference, and that's the role of standard setters in whatever we are looking into. And when we think about, particularly when we think about quality of financial information, isn't it the responsibility of standard setters to enhance this quality? And doesn't it provide us with a great test about the performance of standard setters? Because when you think about air quality or water quality, the first thing is to measure the quality. The second thing is, of course, to point fingers at those who are responsible at this quality if it's not increasing. So no matter how we measure quality of earnings, let's say persistence or the amount of manipulation in it, shouldn't we look at time series over time, changes in quality, and then go back and somehow evaluate those who are responsible for this thing? I think that's a beautiful research question, very important, very difficult to do, probably a whole research area which we don't even touch.
Okay, can I try that one again? Because I had another part of my talk I took out. I found an article that was in Issues in Accounting Education that exactly cited, I think it was the Francis Schipper et al. Paper on the change in earnings relations with returns over time. And it had a quote that said something like this: these are very ominous titles to our papers about the decline in the quality of earnings or the relevance of earnings. And that the takeaway from all of this academic research was that we need to start recognizing intangibles on the balance sheet. Now, if you read any of the academic research that they cited, that was not the conclusion that those papers came to, because they didn't consider the issue of other users and other goals of the standard setters or anything like that. And the academic papers were very careful to write that you wouldn't want to make standard setting inferences from these timeliness studies without further considering the goals of earnings. And yet that's where I think this misuse of the term quality is kind of a problem, because practitioners think of earnings quality. They say, oh, well, if earnings quality is declining, we have to improve it. And then it has the standard setting implication. And even though we're careful in our academic research not to do that, I think it can be misused. And I don't think academics are remiss in addressing important questions about standard setting and how standard setting might improve earnings quality. But I think we also need to be cautious not to ignore these other users and other sources of information and how they play a role in the whole information set that investors use before we go down that path and make statements like that.
I've been asked to call a halt at this stage so we can proceed with the panel at 2:45. A high-quality applause for our high-quality speakers.